Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name's Caitlin, and we are joining you. We are here this evening with the Victorian National Parks Association for a webinar with Dr. Jen Martin. And the Victorian National Parks Association acknowledges the many First Peoples of the area now known as Victoria, honours their continuing connection to and caring for country, and supports traditional owner joint management of parks and public land for conservation of natural and cultural heritage. Our office is located on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We offer our respect to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us this evening. My name is Caitlin, and we're delighted to be able to offer you this webinar with Dr. Jenny Martin on science communication, specially designed for a young adult and early career audience. The webinar is hosted by the Victorian National Parks Association, and we've been at the forefront of nature conservation campaigns for 70 years. We share a vision for Victoria to have a diverse and healthy natural environment protected, respected and enjoyed by all. And we have two main ways we go about working towards this vision. The first one being our campaigning and our advocacy, and the second one being about getting out into nature, people getting out and enjoying nature. And over 70 years, we've advocated for protection of nature in many of the places we cherish today, including Wilson's Promontory, the River Red Gum Parks along the Murray River, the Little Desert and the Alpine National Park, just to name a few. And there are many ways to get into nature with VNPA, including citizen science programs, Reef Watch and Nature Watch, and our bushwalking and activities program. And these are all designed to ensure Victorians have an opportunity to interact with nature in an authentic and caring way. While we are turning 70 this year, we are keen to maintain a connection with people of all ages, including through our Wild Families program and by creating opportunities such as this webinar for young adults. We are also a not-for-profit organisation, and we rely on donations and grant funding to carry out our work. Before introducing Jen, I just wanted to say a few words on the role that science has played in how we go about advocating for and connecting with nature. Our campaigns to protect nature have always had a strong focus on science. For example, the Cattle Out of the High Country campaign, led by the VNPA, focused highly on scientific research carried out over decades on the impact of hard-hooved animals such as cattle in the alpine environment. This science was critical to this campaign. However, matching that, the advocacy carried out by the VNPA was necessary too, to translate the science and show politicians and the community what that science was telling us about this impact and why we needed to do something about it. We also engaged a community in citizen science programs, which involve hundreds of community members gathering highly valuable data on wildlife, such as sea slugs on the sea slug census and mammals on the Life After Fire project out in East Gippsland, both part of the Reef Watch and Nature Watch programs. So I would like to introduce Dr. Jen Martin, and I've had the pleasure of seeing Jen speak on the role of citizen science as a science communication tool, and I was so impressed with her passion for how and why we needed to focus on communicating our science well. Jen is going to speak for around 40 minutes, and following this, we will have question time. And question time will work like this. So if you have a question, you can put it into the chat at any time. We won't be addressing it during the presentation, but we will come to these questions at the end. There'll be around 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So we'll be going through these questions in the background, and I'll be asking the person who put the question in the chat to address that question personally to Jen. So I'll allow you to be able to speak so you can address that question to Jen. So keep a copy of your question with you. And if we don't get to all of the questions, get through all the questions, Jen has also kindly offered to address them via a recording after the session today, which we can circulate. So please also note that the session will be recorded and published online, so other people will get to enjoy Jen's wonderful wisdom. So I'm going to hand you over to Jen. She's the most qualified person to introduce herself, and she'll be telling us a bit about our story. So Jen, are you there and ready to go?
I sure am, Caitlin. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be with you tonight. And, you know, it's pretty luxurious when you get asked to speak about yourself. So I'm not going to speak about myself the whole time, I promise. I'm also here to give you some advice and tips on how you can communicate science more effectively. But I have given my talk kind of two titles. The first one is me talking about how I've ended up so involved with and passionate about science communication. And then the second part of my title is potentially a little bit more controversial, arguing that the science that anyone does, any of us do, isn't finished until it's communicated. If we were in a room, potentially we could all have an argument about that, although perhaps if you've chosen to come tonight, you're not going to want to argue with me about that. But I've taken that second part of my title, in fact, from a quote from a former UK Chief Science Minister, Sir Mark Walport. And I think it's a really excellent quote. I would say we need to add to it. I think this is the first part of the story, that the science anybody does, it doesn't matter how groundbreaking it is, how exciting it is, how important it is for preserving our planet and the biodiversity on our planet, or tackling any of the other major problems in the world. Yes, we need to communicate it effectively to diverse audiences, but that communication needs to be so effective that our audiences understand what the science tells us, what the evidence tells us, and ideally we need our audiences to take action. So I think the communication is a key part of it. It's not the whole story, but the point is that if we don't all learn to communicate science effectively, then we can't hope to have our evidence having an impact in the real world. So, as I said, I'm going to start by telling you how I've ended up as such an advocate and so passionate about science communication before I give you some advice. And we're going to start back here with little Jen in very cool 70s clothes. So that gives you a bit of an idea of my age. And I was really fortunate that I grew up in a family where we did spend a lot of time outdoors. Not always fishing, there were lots of walking and hiking and camping. And I grew up understanding that nature was an integral part of who I was and an essential part of being a human, that the privilege of getting to spend time in natural places was a core part of my well-being and indeed what all humanity needs. That's not to say that, of course, nature shouldn't exist in its own right, because of course it should, but as a child I could understand this very close relationship between people and nature. And I guess because I grew up in a family where science was a thing, I also grew up asking lots of questions. And so I can show you, this is me in year 8, entering the science talent search. And I was really interested to understand the chickens, the backyard chooks that we had in our family. I wanted to understand why the yolks of those eggs were often a different colour to the yolks of the eggs that you would buy in the shop. And it made me ask my parents, you know, does that mean that they're feeding the people who are selling eggs commercially, are giving particular, you know, potentially nasty additives to their chickens to get these yolks to be the perfect colour like we see on all the ads? So I probably won't give you enough time to read about my aim and my hypothesis, because I'm not sure I really understood quite what both of those things were back then. But I did have a lot of fun feeding our chooks different foods, and then getting out my paints and working out exactly what colour their yolks ended up being, depending on what we fed them. So you can see I'm kind of a science nerd from way back. And I attribute that partly to this man who is my dad. And what he's holding in his hand that you can barely see is this tiny little frog. It's actually a toadlet, and it was named after my dad. So I feel very proud that this is Martin's toadlet, Euparolia martini, and my dad spent many years researching frogs all around Australia. And so I certainly grew up understanding that the way we can potentially preserve nature and conserve nature is by understanding it. We need to study it. We need to know what animals need in order to be able to look after them. And one of the most special experiences for me of nature was realizing as an adult that my father was never actually sure he'd held his little frog in his hand. And so heading out to Gippsland and managing to find only one but one of this Martin's toadlet. And that's my son, who is now a teenager who's taller than me. So it was a while ago now, but it was a pretty special experience. So it's not surprising then, given my upbringing, given my sense of passion for nature and my sense that science was a way to try and preserve nature and look after nature, that I became an ecologist. So this is me as a PhD student. I spent many years studying this particular species, which is a mountain brush-tailed possum, or a bowbuck. And when I started working on them, we actually didn't know that much about them. We knew a few basics. You can hear my dog is barking in the background. I'll let her go for a minute, but I might have to dash in a second and open the door for her. But we really didn't know that much about this particular species of possum. And so I spent many years, really hard years, but also joyful years, working in some patches of forest, trying to understand this animal's behaviour, their social system, their mating system. And I felt just so privileged to have the opportunity to spend my time living in a forest, following these animals around and understanding what they needed in terms of their habitat and their diet, and how their behaviour was influenced by living in either intact or in partially logged forest. And it was a pretty formative experience. And these forests that I got to work in, I worked both in some intact forest and also along roadside strips of habitat. It really made me understand just how much I loved being in nature. But it also raised a whole lot of questions for me, because I did what I was told to do, essentially, by the culture that I operated in, the research culture. As an academic, I was told that what I needed to do was collect the data and publish papers. So I did that. I published my research. I was also told that giving talks at academic conferences was very important. So I certainly did that. I went to lots of conferences. But what really, really struck me, and I remember vividly, I'm sorry, I'm Caitlin, I'm just going to disappear for like 2 seconds while I let my barking dog out. I promise I'll be straight back.
Thanks, Jen.
Okay,
all good.
I'm so sorry, but I just figured she was just going to sit there and keep barking at the back door. It's probably a possum out in the garden, so it's very fitting, really. I thought rather than just letting her sit there and bark, I would pay attention.
All good.
So I remember vividly this particular night where I was very tired. Working on a nocturnal animal is wonderful, you know, the experience of the night sky and all of the things that you see working in a forest in Australia at night. It was incredibly special, but it was also exhausting. And I remember one night sitting on my favourite granite outcrop in the forest and just bawling my eyes out, to be honest, and just thinking, you know, what's the point? I'm doing what I know I'm meant to do. I'm publishing these papers and I'm building my academic track record, and you know, I'm ticking these boxes. But in actual fact, the people with the power to conserve these forests and look after all of the habitat that I care about around Australia, they're not the academics. They're the farmers and the land managers, and it's these people and the politicians that I need to be speaking with. And so I sort of tried to do that, in the sense that, you know, I did make sure I spoke with Landcare and the Field Naturalist group. And, you know, I did try and do some of that stuff. But fundamentally, I realized this huge problem, and that was that no one had ever trained me to communicate with different audiences. I knew how to talk with other scientists. I knew how to write for other scientists. But it just dawned on me, there's this massive gap in my education, that it had never before dawned on me that actually the people with the power to make a difference in the world were not the other scientists. It was a whole lot of other people that I needed to be communicating with. And that really struck me and made me think a lot about what I actually wanted to do with my life. And it really occurred to me that communication was such a fundamental part of being an effective scientist. And I couldn't see where most of our scientists were being trained to do that. And so as I looked around the world at all of these problems, climate change, light pollution, habitat clearance, plastic, everything, everywhere I looked, I just felt this sense of powerlessness that to some extent we have the evidence. We know what we need to do to improve the way we live on this planet and the way we overconsume on this planet, but we're not taking action. And it struck me that a key part of that was to do with communication, because, these are just two of umpteen examples of cartoonists really nailing it, where it didn't seem to matter what the scientists said, that other people would still say, oh, well, that's not something that we trust, or that's not something we're going to take action on, or that's not something that we understand. And so I became more and more certain that communication was a missing piece in the education for many, many scientists. And the thing that really struck me was it wasn't just about doing good in the world, it was also about our scientists getting jobs. So this is from an annual survey of employers that happens in Australia. And essentially this is asking employers, well, what are the skills or what are the characteristics that are most important to you when you recruit people to work with you? And how important are they when you make decisions about who you're actually going to employ? And you can see that communication comes right out on top, and technical skills tend to be, way down the bottom. So yes, we need to make sure people have an understanding of how science works, and all of these other things are important for sure. But we need to make sure that the students who are leaving the university have really, really excellent communication skills. And I couldn't see where that was happening. So after my PhD, I started teaching at the University of Melbourne. I discovered as a PhD student just how much I adored teaching. And I was really fortunate to be offered a one-year position, a teaching position. But by this stage, it had really struck me just how essential communication skills were. And yet when I asked kind of the powers that be at the university at the time, excuse me, but where do we train our scientists in effective communication? Because that's how they're going to have impact in the world with their science beyond the university system. And the answer I got was, oh, they just pick it up by osmosis. And I fundamentally disagree. I don't think we pick up skills by osmosis. That's like me saying, oh, I want to be a concert violinist. All I need to do is hang around with some concert violinists and I'll just pick up their skills by osmosis. I mean, that's complete nonsense, right? If I wanted to be a concert violinist, well, I'd definitely have to have some talent to begin with, but I'd have to work really, really hard. I would have to have a great teacher. I would have to practice all the time. I would have to have a teacher who would listen to me and give me feedback and encourage me to keep doing better and better. We don't learn skills by osmosis. It just doesn't happen. So at this point, I decided that I wasn't going to be a researcher anymore. As much as I love nature, as much as I loved being an ecologist, and I've had the opportunity to work all around Australia in some amazing habitats with some incredible wildlife, I decided that the most useful thing I could do would be to train scientists how to be effective communicators so that their work could make it out into the real world and have impact, and not just stay within the journals and the conferences. Because not only is it really important for our scientists to get jobs, to have brilliant communication skills, but the reality is that the vast majority of research that is carried out in Australia is funded by taxpayers. And I believe then that we have an ethical obligation to make our research accessible to those taxpayers, for those taxpayers who are the public to understand what was the research about. What did they find out? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for the world? And so it became very clear to me that this was my calling and this was my journey to science communication. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that my ideas met with quite a lot of resistance. Had a lot of well-meaning senior people tell me that if you walk away from a research career, you'll never have a career in academia in Australia. I had many one-year contracts in the process of me trying to convince my university that teaching communication skills was essential. But I'm happy to say that I can now talk to you, I think maybe 12 years on from designing my first communication subject. And now I find myself in an incredible position where I just adore what I do. I get to do work that I really believe in the value of. Not that I didn't believe in the value of being an ecologist, but I feel this way I'm having a much bigger impact given the skills that I have. So I get to do lots of fun and enjoyable things. I get to give lots of talks to any group that you can imagine, including being with you tonight. I've got to do some crazy fun stuff like being on commercial TV, which is not something I've done before. I get to MC lots of events and support all sorts of events with scientists. I've got to have fun podcast interviews with some pretty amazing comedians like Judith Lucy and Ross Noble. I've got a book coming out, which I've been really excited to work on. And probably I've interacted with some of you I know via the radio that I do. So I've been talking about science on 3RRR for about 16 years now. So deciding that I wanted to invest my time and energy in communicating science to other people has led me to have some really incredible and fun experiences that I'm so grateful for. But by far the most wonderful part of what I do is the team that I've been able to put together, I guess, establish at Melbourne Uni. This is my team, and we are all either current or former researchers who are really driven by this deep, deep commitment to training scientists in effective communication. So we come from a mix of backgrounds. So between us, I'm obviously a biologist, we have an exercise scientist, an immunologist, a physicist and a climate scientist. And together we teach scientists across all disciplines how to communicate their work more effectively. And to me, this is where the big impact really comes from. This is the ripple effect that I feel so proud of. You know, when I stay in touch with many of our former students, and there's now thousands and thousands and thousands of them, some of them have moved into working in science communication. Many of them are working in science in all different areas, but they would all say that learning to be an effective communicator has helped them. And so in our team, we're now trying to spread our teaching as widely as we can in accessible ways. So if you're interested in any of these topics, and I'm about to start giving you some tips on effective science communication, this is our podcast. Each episode is short, easily accessible, nice and easy to listen to. And we cover all sorts of different topics in communication. So you should be able to find Let's Talk sci-comm wherever you listen to podcasts. And just before I get into some tips, I guess one of the real pinnacles of things that I've had the opportunity to do as someone who is passionate about communication was be part of this largest women-only expedition to Antarctica, which happened just before the world went crazy. So this was 112 women from 35 different countries at the very end of 2019 in Antarctica, which I can't believe how fortunate we were. These are all women in STEM who all came together to learn to be more effective leaders. And my role was to do some of the teaching on that course around effective communication. And of course, you know, as an ecologist, getting to go to somewhere like Antarctica was the most incredible privilege ever. One of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, and also one of the most upsetting places I've ever been to in terms of thinking about what we stand to lose given the trajectory that the planet is currently on, which I think really just makes me redouble my energy and commitment and enthusiasm around making sure that everyone involved in science, whatever the area, has the skills to communicate their work to different audiences in a way that those audiences will understand, will want to take action, will want to do what needs to be done to make a difference in the world. Because, you know, scientists tend to have this feeling or this idea that their work doesn't interest other people, that people who don't study science aren't interested in science and don't care about science, but that couldn't be further from the truth. We have really good evidence. We have excellent survey work to show that actually people are very interested in science. Your average person, if there is such a thing, finds science fascinating and interesting, but they often find science difficult to understand. So our job, or any of us who are involved in science, our job is not to say, oh, you won't get it or you're not interested in it. but is to find a way to make our work relevant and accessible for other people. And I feel like when I first went into science communication, it was because I thought, science is so cool. Science is so amazing. I want everyone to think science is as wonderful as I do. Remember, I'm a science geek from way back. But I think over the last decade or so, as I've got more involved in communicating about science, for me now it's become much more about equity. It's much more about recognizing the incredible privilege I have as a white English speaker who's had access to a really high level education, and recognizing that a lot of people in the world don't have that luxury. And if I can help make sure they have access to science in an understandable way so that they can make good evidence-based decisions, then that's a huge contribution that I can make. And I really encourage everyone, all of us who've had access to education, to think about how we can acknowledge that privilege by making sure the knowledge that we have is more accessible. But of course, science communication for many years, fell into the trap of what this is representing. This cartoon is representing the deficit model. The deficit model where I, as the scientist, believe I'm an expert and all I have to do is tell you what I know, and you will therefore understand it and be interested in it and take action on it. And of course, that's not how it works. That's absolutely not how it works. We need to engage our audiences. We need to make our work relevant to our audiences. We need to bring our audiences in, and often we need to tell stories in order to get people engaged. And we need to recognize how important our audiences are. I think it's very easy to get caught up in it's all about me. It's me and my talking or my writing. It's all about me. But of course, it's actually not really about me. This is about you. This is about our audiences. This is about thinking about how we can honor our audience's time and energy and attention, and recognizing that our audience, even if they haven't had training in science, it doesn't mean they're dumb. It just means they haven't had the same training that you might have had if you've got a background in science. And I really love this quote from journalist Tim Radford. Don't overestimate your audience's knowledge, but don't underestimate their intelligence. When we communicate about science, we don't have to assume that people don't have the ability to understand science. Of course they do. They just haven't studied it before, or they're not immersed in that world. So we can't overestimate the background knowledge they have. That is where the problem comes from. So what I want to do then is just give you a quick rundown on some basic advice for any of you who are thinking about communicating more broadly about your knowledge. And the first thing I want to share with you is this acronym GAMPER, which I find really useful before I undertake any form of communication. And each of these letters reminds me of something that I need to think about. So G stands for goal. What's the goal of this communication activity? A, unsurprisingly, stands for audience. Who's the audience that I need to communicate with? And what's the message that I'm going to have to really carefully craft and tailor for this particular audience? And often your message might not be actually what you think you should be talking about. It has to be tailored very carefully for what your audience wants or needs to hear, what's relevant to them. Platform is really important that it comes after goal and audience and message, because often I find, particularly students who suddenly get excited about communication, they say, oh, I'm going to start a podcast, or I'm going to write a blog, or I'm going to do something on Twitter, or whatever it is. And that's great. The enthusiasm is wonderful. I love it. But the question is that the right platform to reach that audience? We have to think very carefully about which platforms to use in order to actually find the people that we want to be communicating with. And the E and the R are just to remind us that, as with most things in life, this is a cyclical process. It's not like you're going to communicate a message about biodiversity conservation once and you're going to have solved all the problems. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So we have to always be evaluating what we're doing when it comes to communicating, and then refining it based on what we learn through our evaluation. So really be disciplined with yourself, and before you undertake any communication, think about these questions. How are you going to be strategic? You have limited time, energy, money, capacity. So what would be a successful outcome from this particular activity? What's the impact that you're looking for? And given that goal, who is the audience who can help you reach that goal? Who has the agency? Who has the influence in this situation? And of course, once you're clear on the audience you're trying to reach and how that links with your goal, your message is going to have to be really carefully crafted. As I said, think very carefully about platform. Don't decide platform first, because it may turn out that you invest all of your time or energy or money in a platform that's not going to link you with this particular audience. And be ready to the best of your ability, evaluate whether it's been effective, and then to refine what you're doing. And of course, we need to be realistic. There's no point in declaring the only way I'm going to have a successful outcome is to spend, 15 hours a day doing this thing, because that's not going to happen. But GAMPER is a tool that you can just always have in the back of your mind before you do any sort of communicating, just to double check, what am I trying to achieve here? And then really beyond that, let's think about how you are going to craft a message that is going to work for this audience, because crafting messages is such an important part of communication. And the first thing to always think about is, how are you going to capture your audience's attention? We just have to always remember that our audiences right now, they're fatigued, they're distracted. I don't know how many of you are listening to this while doing a whole lot of other things, and no judgment here, I totally get it. But if you're going to convince people to read your writing or follow your work on social media or listen to you speak, you're going to have to immediately grab their attention and convince them that this is worth their time and attention, which really means you're going to have to think carefully about how to make it relevant to them. Not what's relevant to you. It's already obviously relevant to you, or you wouldn't be doing this communicating. How are you going to make it relevant to them? And really, in terms of thinking about achieving your goal, you need to be clear. What is it that you want your audience to do differently? Or how do you want them to think differently after this? I always think about communication as me giving an audience a gift. What do I want that gift to be like? What do I want them to have that they didn't have prior to listening to me or reading my words? And of course, really, all of this comes down to convincing your audience why what you're offering them is valuable. Why should they care? Why is this meaningful to them? Because if we can't convince our audiences to care, then I think we've already failed in our communication. And of course, the only way to get people to care is to make sure you've crafted a message that is going to resonate with them. Language, of course, is really important, and scientists do get a pretty terrible reputation for using language that's inaccessible and alienating. So we have to think about the language that our audience knows and make sure we're not falling into the trap of using technical language that is fine if you're talking to somebody else who does what you do, but is not fine for this particular audience. Similarly, with context, if you're speaking to somebody else who does similar work to you, you can jump straight to the guts of it. You don't have to spend time giving all of this basic background information. But if you're talking to an audience who isn't in your area, you might need to provide quite a bit of context so they know, why does this matter? And of course, we have to be really disciplined about leaving things out. If you're an expert in a particular area, there's so much that you know, there's so much that you care about. There's so much that you believe is interesting and important. To this audience, half of it might be irrelevant or boring. So we have to cut back and stick with what is essential. And the advice that scientists are given all the time, which is excellent advice, is to tell a story. And I don't have time this evening to go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say, if you've heard that advice before, it is very good advice. We know from a lot of work in neuroscience and psychology that human brains are really hardwired to pay attention to and remember stories. We're not that good on facts. We can gloss over facts, we can ignore them. People who just tell you fact after fact after fact, you're probably not going to remember very much of it. But if you can tell someone a story, and a story usually revolves around a problem. So if I'm talking about my research, I might say, well, look, I know, we know this and we know this, but we don't know this thing. And that's why I'm doing research on this. That problem solution dynamic is what gets people interested. So storytelling is really important. What I want to do with the time that I have left is just give you some top tips for the two areas that you might spend time, or the sort of outputs that you might concentrate on. One being writing for a non-scientifically trained audience, and one being giving a talk about your work. So these are just going to be my kind of high level top tips, and certainly we have podcast episodes with more advice if these are things that you do or that you would like to learn to do better. But my first piece of advice about writing is to be aware that if you do have scientific training, you've been taught to write in a particular way, a quite formal way, and in a way that basically no one else likes to read. Scientists get trained to write in such a formal academic style that is not a good style of writing when it comes to anybody else. So we have to step back as scientists and say, I'm going to write in a different way because now I am writing for a non-scientific audience. So that means things like simpler words, shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs, subheadings, all sorts of ways we can make our writing more accessible. And one of the things that we talk about with our students a lot is recognizing the difference between what we call a wild audience and a captive audience. And one of the things that we find, particularly with the students that we teach, is that they've spent a lot of their time writing for what I call a captive audience. A captive audience is someone who has to read what you've written. Think about it. When you went to high school, if you went to university, if you maybe wrote a thesis, you knew that somebody had to read that stuff. So you didn't think as much about how you wrote it. When we write about science for more general audiences, we have a wild audience. A wild audience doesn't have to read it. And if they find it hard to read, they will just move on and read something else. So we have to really focus on how we write. So as I said, subheadings can really help an audience to be focused on what you're writing about. Topic sentences, something you probably learned at school and may not have used since. The idea that the first sentence of every paragraph should establish what that paragraph is going to be about. So that if somebody just wants to skim read and go from first sentence to first sentence to first sentence of your paragraphs, they'll still get the gist of it. These structuring, ways we structure writing make a big, big difference. Always choose a simple word where you can. There's so many big words that sneak into science writing. I feel like scientists were told somewhere along the way they had to try and sound intelligent. One of my pet hates is the word utilize. Not one student over the last 12 years has been able to give me a sentence yet in which the word utilize was a better choice than the word use. So don't just default into using big words if you don't need to. If at all possible, write in active voice. If you don't know the difference between active and passive voice, I don't have time to go into it tonight, but it's something you can teach yourself very easily. Writing in active voice and writing in first person. Being willing to use the words I, my, we, our. It's much easier for somebody to understand if you write that way. And the best way to improve our writing and to make it more conversational and accessible is to read our writing aloud. And I mean speaking aloud like I am now, not just reading it in your head. By reading what we write aloud, we hear what it sounds like for our reader. And that's how we can work out when our sentences are too long or whatever it is that we've done that make our writing difficult to understand. And the last point to make is that I think titles are really important when we're writing for more general audiences. Because think yourself, next time you're sitting there scrolling through, news articles or whatever it is on your phone that you're looking at, you make really snap decisions about whether you think something is interesting and worth reading or not. So we have to come up with good titles. But of course, as well as being engaging, they have to be informative and accurate. As science communicators, we have to be accurate in what we communicate. All right, moving on to public speaking, which I think is a really important skill and something that most people find difficult and potentially quite stressful, but a really fantastic opportunity to engage with people and share your knowledge. And, public speaking can be a kind of a formal talk like I'm giving now up on a stage, But it can also just be talking to someone you bump into, chatting with someone on a train or chatting with someone at the shops. You know, we all have opportunities to share science and share our understanding of how the world works from a scientific point of view anytime we have chats with people. But again, if you're going to try and convince somebody to listen to you, you've got to start with something interesting and relevant. It's just so important that we convince people very quickly, this is going to be useful, this is worth you paying attention to. And beyond that, we have to think about public speaking really as a relationship. And obviously it's really difficult for me tonight to feel that way because I'm not in a room with you. I can't see your faces. I just have to trust that hopefully a couple of you are listening to me and finding this interesting, finding this relevant. But if you do have the chance to converse with people, you know, to have a conversation with people, think about how you can connect with them. Think about how you can treat this person with respect and with interest and bring information to them that is going to be meaningful. And if you are talking about your own research, which I know some of you are researchers, or indeed any science work, you know, try and tell a story. What's the problem here that you're trying to solve? And why does this problem matter? That's how we get people interested. Again, of course, I'm going to say know what you can leave out. Just because you think it's cool or interesting or important doesn't mean it's important or interesting for this audience. So always make sure you know what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve, and who the audience is that you're connecting with. And a really, really important point just to make quickly, if you are in the situation where you're giving a talk with visuals, as I am now, you need to know about something called the collar vita effect. And the collar vita effect tells us that if you provide a person, an adult, simultaneously with something that they can hear and something that they can see, they might believe that they can multitask and take in both of those pieces of information at once, but they can't. You can't, I can't. We take in one at a time, and always the thing that we take in first is what we can see. So what that means is that if you have busy slides with lots of information, in the time that it takes your audience to understand, read, make sense of those slides, they're not listening to a word you say. So you will have noticed that I'm building my slides a point at a time, and I'm only ever bringing up text when I speak to that point. Because if I'd put up this slide at the start, all of this at once, you just would have read the slide from top to bottom. And the time it took you to do that, you wouldn't have been listening to me. If I'd put up some complex figure and you were trying to understand it, you wouldn't have been listening to me. So if we want our audience to listen, we have to be really mindful of how complex our slides are and how long they take to read. Of course, nerves are a really big deal for most people with public speaking, and don't for a second think that you're unusual if you feel very nervous. And in fact, being nervous is very good. Being nervous means that you care. If you don't feel nervous about speaking in front of people, you probably don't care very much, and you're probably not going to do a very good job. Because I guarantee you, if I asked you what makes a really great talk or what makes a really great speaker, you'd say passion, enthusiasm. And if you don't care, it's very hard to feel those things. But the key thing to know, and this is evidence-based advice, this isn't just me talking off the top of my head. What we know about nerves is that for you, for your body, physiologically feeling very nervous, very worried, very frightened is actually almost identical to feeling very excited. So when you feel very worried before you give a talk, it's because you have a lot of stress hormones in your system. And so the standard advice we get given as a way to deal with nerves, which is just take a deep breath and calm down, is really stupid advice, because taking a deep breath doesn't get cortisol and adrenaline out of your bloodstream. So instead, you have to make that feeling of anxiety turn into a feeling of excitement. You have to tell yourself, instead of the self-talk being, I hate speaking in public, I'm really bad at it, I don't want to do it, it's going to be a disaster. Instead, your self-talk has to be, I'm really excited. What an amazing opportunity to share something that I care about with this audience. I feel really lucky to have this opportunity. And research has shown, just by saying to yourself over and over again, I'm excited, I feel excited, you can turn your nerves into something positive rather than something that can potentially be very, very debilitating. So don't worry about your nerves, they're good, but practice strategies to deal with them. And a final point, if you do feel nervous, just being aware that either trying to memorize or trying to read a talk, both of them are a disaster. You will get stuck, you will lose where you're up to, and you certainly can't create a connection with your audience if you're doing those things. So to finish, I want to share with you an analogy that a friend told me many years ago that's really stayed with me. So look at this beautiful picnic scene by the river in Paris. It's a beautiful day. Everyone's relaxing in the afternoon. This beautiful scene I take to be the world that I want to live in, where people look after each other, where people look after the planet, where we have a sustainable future, and where people make evidence-based decisions and believe in the value of science. That's my lovely picnic. And if we look at this as a whole scene, it might feel overwhelming. How on earth am I going to contribute to getting to this wonderful place where all of those things are true? Well, you can't fix it all. You can't possibly fix it all. You're one person. But of course, if we zoom in closely to this picture, we discover that it's made of lots and lots and lots of little dots. And so your job is simply to choose your dot. You can't make that whole picture come true, but you can choose your dot. And maybe for you, it's being a farmer. Maybe for you, it's being a researcher. Maybe for you, it's being a teacher. Maybe for you, it's being a communicator. You should just choose the dot that aligns with the values that you have and what you believe you can contribute and what's important to you and where you believe you have skills. You don't have to do it all. But if we all take charge of a dot or two, then I think we can get there. So I really encourage you just to come back to remember what your goal is. What do you want to do with your time and with your knowledge and with your ability? What is it that we're trying to achieve on this planet? And I'm sure you're here because you believe that conserving biodiversity is a really important part of that. And so every time things get difficult, I think we just have to come back to our why. Come back to realizing that we can't fix all of the problems, but we can all make a contribution. We can choose our dot and we can make our contribution to try and make the world a better place. And I feel so fortunate that for me, I came across this idea of communicating about science and realized it was something that I really believe in and something where I believe that I can have an impact. So I'm really grateful to you all for giving me your time and attention this evening. I hope there was something useful in that for you. And I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Jen. That was wonderful. And I certainly got some lovely tips out of that. I really like the quote around don't overestimate people's knowledge, but don't underestimate their intelligence. It's a really nice way to think about when we're communicating with an audience. That was really nice.
Yeah, because we assume people are just like us, but they're not necessarily just like us.
Yeah, yeah, and their intelligence might be quite different.
So, yeah, they have different expertise. It's just as valid and useful as yours. It's just different. So we all need to be more inclusive in the way we communicate.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jen. I was certainly very inspired. We have a question here from Stephanie Jones. And Stephanie, if you're there, it would be great if you could put this question to Jen yourself. I'm going to allow you to talk. So hopefully you are there. See how we go. Are you there? Yes, you are. Hi, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you, Jen, very much. Very interesting talk. I'm just wondering whether you have any tips on communicating science/facts to politicians. In my experience, most of them don't think beyond their own policy agenda.
Yeah, Stephanie, look, I think it's a really superb and important question. And look, I can't pretend to have a lot of experience in that area. It's not something that I've successfully done myself, but look, I do work with people who do that, and we certainly have people come and talk with our students about how to effectively communicate with politicians. And it's interesting, I've had a few different people come and speak to that topic, and all of them have given the same advice, which kind of goes a little bit against what you've said, and that is, remember that politicians are people. You know, they are people who, you know, who also deal with the things that the rest of us deal with. So although I absolutely agree with you that they are beholden to often toe the party line, and they're just thinking about what it is that they're trying to achieve from a policy point of view. The advice has always been, these are people too. These are people who respond to narrative. These are people who respond to emotion. These are people who will be interested in a story if you can tell them and help them to understand how it's relevant to them and their constituents. Climate change surely is relevant to all of us, but look, I'm also really open to other people's feedback, Stephanie, because I think it's such an important question and not something that I feel that I can give you the perfect answer to. But I guess it's just all about how can you make it relevant to them. Maybe it's a matter of working out what they're currently focusing on in their policies and work out a way to speak to that.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Stephanie. I've got another question here around how do you know if you've been successful with your communication?
Look, I don't think it's black and white. I think there are absolute levels of grey in terms of successful, and it all comes down to what your goal was and what you define as success. If your goal is to get people to sign up to a newsletter, well, it's going to come down to, how many more people sign up to your newsletter or how many people follow your Twitter account. If your goal is to raise awareness in a particular group of people about the value of a particular citizen science project, well, then it's about whether you've successfully raised that interest. Is it about going to schools and encouraging kids to think about studying science? I think it all comes down to being clear on the goal and then assessing what you achieve relative to that. But I think we also have to be careful not to just stick to numbers. I see a lot of communication strategies where it all comes down to number of likes, number of subscriptions, number of hits, number of this. And look, for sure, those things are there because largely they're easy to measure. And so when you've got KPIs to meet, it's really easy if you can just tick boxes and say, yes, I got that number of subscribers. But I really think, given the state of the world, we have to realize that it's all a bit more nuanced than that. And if we go by kind of all or nothing metrics, I think we lose sight of the fact that every time we get somebody to just question themselves or question their behavior or question their biases or to have a conversation with somebody else that they might not have had otherwise, I think all of those things are really important contributors. So how do you know if you've been successful? I think only you can decide what your measures of success are, but I think we have to think broadly about success. I don't know, Caitlin, would you add anything to that from the VNPA position?
Again, I would agree. Actually, it depends on your audience, what you want that success to be, and trying to sort out what success looks like for you, and also from the user's end as well, or the user or the person who's listening or paying attention, what success is for them. What do they get excited about? Is success, that people walked away from the day really excited about marine life that they didn't know about before? If you can see the smiling faces walking away, have you been successful? It depends on what it is. Yeah. I've got one more question for you. Have you got any examples of perhaps one of your favourite or highlights around some science communication that you've seen that you feel like has done a really great job of crafting a message and communicating with that audience that you have seen, maybe related to nature?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I kind of want to say either everything or I can't think of a single thing. I mean, look, I think I'm involved in Children's Nature Book Week with the Wilderness Society, and I think some children's books are just so brilliant at communicating, with their chosen audience. I think, there's some incredible kids' books out there that I absolutely love. And then I think, if we think of COVID, there's been some incredible examples of pieces of journalism where, remember Flatten the Curve, it's deep, dark history now in the early stage of the pandemic, but those figures that went around, those simple animations that show that if we just slow the spread of the disease, we have a massive impact on how our hospitals are going to cope with infection rates. I think there's so many examples out there. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read Deani Lewis, who used to be a radio colleague of mine. She's written a book called Unvaxxed. And it's a really interesting piece, but part sort of personal story and part scientific research, talking about how it is that we have a whole group of people out there who are so hesitant and so worried about vaccination and so convinced that vaccination is a bad thing, despite all the evidence to the contrary. That's a really good piece of writing. I don't know, I guess I soak up good science communication wherever I go. And I think it's people who, you know, who are clear on their goal and clear on their audience and don't assume that people will be interested just because they are. You know, that's the trap we fall into all the time, because those of us who are really passionate about science or nature, we just can't imagine that other people don't feel the same way. And so we just assume that people are automatically going to be caught up in it in the same way as we are. And that's just not the case. Or if that is the case, then we're only preaching to the converted, and we're well beyond. You know, we need to do far more than preach to the converted. So every example I can think of people who've thought strategically about, okay, what's the message here? And who am I trying to share it with, and how am I going to make it a relevant story for them? But I mean, I'd love people to put into the Q&A or into the chat, you know, examples of amazing science communication, because I can just think of so many. If you've never read any of Ed Yong's work, Ed Yong writes for The Atlantic. He won the Pulitzer Prize, I think last year or the year before. He's done a lot of reporting during the pandemic, and I think he's an incredible science writer. I strongly recommend reading Ed Yong's work. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And I love that you referred to children's books as great science communication.
100%.
Yeah, because absolutely, they can be, for sure.
Yeah, I think, and particularly during, you know, these years of lockdowns when a lot of kids didn't have the opportunity to spend as much time in nature as we might have wanted to, I think books became an absolutely essential part of bringing nature into children's lives.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And I think for me, you know, take home is that your the GAMPER. I mean, that's something you can apply just about anywhere, to any science, to any science communication by the sounds of it. You know, and you could apply that to your politicians as well, equally, if you say that your audience is the politicians.
Yep.
Yeah, and then moving through that process. I think that's really valuable. So it is getting on to 7:02, so we are going to close the webinar now. So I would like to thank Jen very, very much for such a wonderful session and really interesting tips for people who are out there who are scientists, particularly some of our early career folk who are getting into this world of conservation, which is a wonderful, wonderful world. But yeah, being able to take that idea of how we communicate well with our different audiences is a wonderful thing to be able to do. So thank you very much for everybody who has come and joined us this evening, and a huge thank you to Jen for such a fascinating presentation. And I will be taking away some of those messages myself and using them in my work too. So thanks everybody, and hopefully we will hear from you and see you again soon. And there will be a recording of the webinar as well, which we will be able to circulate, and we'll pop it up on our website as well, with some of our other webinars, which you can view on the VMPA website. So you can share those with your friends as well, if you like. So thank you all very much for coming, and you will hear from us. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. I really appreciate it.